Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Informed Perspectives, Rethinking the Spirituality of Hong Kong Protests with our esteemed guests, Ting Guo, Antony Dapiran, Shirley Lin, and Emanuele Berry. Today's webinar is hosted by the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. I'm Curtis Schaefer, co-director of the lab. This program is a continuation of the lab's series, Informed Perspectives, which brings journalists, documentarians, and humanities scholars into conversation about issues concerning religion, race, and politics. We'd like to thank the Luce Foundation and the ACLS Program in Religion, Journalism, and International Affairs for so generously sponsoring this event. We hope you will join us again on Thursday, March 4th for the next program in our series, featuring a screening of the lab's newest documentary film, God and Green, An Unholy Alliance. This film is about religion, politics, race, and climate change. For more information, go to religionlab.virginia.edu/events. Now, a few notes to our audience, who I want to encourage to raise questions throughout our event. To do so, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. The chat and raise hands functions have been disabled. If we have time at the end, we'll field some of your questions. Please note all attendees have the ability to upvote each other's questions. Also, we are recording today's webinar, which will be made available on the lab's website next week. And now I'd like to turn it over to our hosts, Clara Ma and Matthew Slaats. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Clara Ma, a PhD candidate in the McIntyre Department of Arts.
And I'm Matthew Slaats, a PhD candidate in the UVA School of Architecture. So if you arrived a little early, you may have heard some audio of Hong Kong. We wanted to start the webinar by kind of setting the scene and creating a connection both mentally and emotionally with all that has been going on in Hong Kong over the last few years. Though we also wanted to start by playing another brief audio clip.
What we're hearing is an audio from the 2019 protests, the protests that brought millions of people to the street in response to a proposed change to the extradition law in Hong Kong, which would allow Hong Kong to detain and transfer people suspect of crimes to jurisdictions which the city does not have existing bilateral extradition agreements before, including mainland China, Taiwan, Macau. So though it is the last bit of the audio that we just heard, like when protesters were singing hallelujah to the Lord, that piqued our interest. What is this meaning, and why would it become such a vital part of the protests?
Yeah, so we see this and other examples where religion and protest are mixing in Hong Kong. There were shrines, there were hymns, churches became a site of safety. So during the summer of 2020, with the support of the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab, Clara and I had this amazing opportunity to create a podcast that allowed us to dig a little deeper into what the protests practices meant to Hong Kong.
Our initial focus was on these hymns and also altars that were created in response to the death of several protesters. Though as we speak to people, we realized that these activities were part of a larger picture. So we began to think about the relationship between faith in religion and faith in democracy, and how these form a spirituality that manifests in these protests.
And so while we spoke to so many amazing people during the editing process of the podcast, we could only really share very small snippets of what were really amazing experiences of all that was going on in Hong Kong. So tonight, or morning, if you were calling or listening in from Asia, we wanted really just to bring some of those voices back together. And add a few new ones to more deeply engage the ideas and think about their connection around the globe, especially at this moment.
So joining us are four great panelists, which I have the pleasure to introduce. Ting Guo, a scholar of religious studies, we're based in University of Hong Kong, whose research focuses on like political religion and post-secularism. Antony Dapiran, a Hong Kong-based lawyer and the author of 2 books on Hong Kong protests, including City of Protests, A Recent History of Dissent in Hong Kong, and the most recent book, City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong. Shirley Lin, professor in world politics at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at the University of Virginia and expert on China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, international political economy, national identities. And Emanuele, executive editor of This American Life, who has covered stories in both the United States and Hong Kong.
Great. And so we want to start by turning our conversation over to Professor Ting Guo. To set the stage, though, we wanted to play one more short clip to get us moving forward.
So I would like to first ask Ting, could you share, tell us a little bit about what we just hear, or what are some of the religious activities that we saw in the protests, and why we see such use of religious rituals and symbols in the protests? And further, in general, like in Hong Kong, what is the relationship between religious identity and political identity?
Yeah, sure, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. Really excited to be here. As Clara mentioned, and as you've just heard from the audio clips, there's just a great diversity of religious elements throughout the protest. So I would like to introduce this notion of diffused religion, or religious diffusion, to describe this kind of great diversity, really heterogeneous diversity of religion in Hong Kong. So why do we see so many religious elements throughout the protest? It's because religion is everywhere. Religion is deeply embedded in everyday life, in social life, political life, in everyday life. I think that's the nature of religious diffusion, is that religious activities or religious elements and religious rituals are not so divorced from social, secular structures and secular elements. So in particular in Chinese societies, as sociologist C.K. Yang introduced this notion in the 60s to explain why maybe religion in China or Chinese religions are not so obvious compared to maybe Christianity in Europe, for instance. It is because so many of the elements are in the everyday life or in the secular life. For instance, in imperial China, you see kingship, you see the structure of society, how things work in general, and these are all religious elements. And in today's Hong Kong, if you're walking in central Hong Kong, in the busiest financial political center in Hong Kong, but at the same time, you also see maybe little shrines, little offerings, maybe in the shadow of the big buildings, and in the homes of people's. Even for Christians, you also see the offerings, maybe, and the food we eat, the festivals, the way we celebrate certain festivals, and that's also how religions are carried out, are practiced in Hong Kong. in Chinese societies in general. So that's the definition of diffused religion. And it is because religions are so integrated, so intimately related to everyday life, to social life and political life, that we see this kind of very interesting religious elements throughout the protest. I think, and the most obvious one and the most prominent one maybe is Christianity, because Christianity is it's such a marker. It's in particularly organized, and it's easier to spot than other religions. So we see sing Hallelujah to the Lord. I think that we heard that just now from the audio clip. These organized form of religious activities, they are easier to spot, and quite often people would relate that to Hong Kong's colonial history, because Hong Kong was once colonized by Britain, and that's why we see Christianity maybe. But it's not that simple. There's a longer history of the Cold War, of Hong Kong social history that has made Christianity a religion with more social capital, or easier to spot, a more obvious organized form of religion in Hong Kong. And it wasn't until, for instance, the Cold War, when the colonial government wanted to curb the enthusiasm, nationalistic enthusiasm in Hong Kong, the Chinese community in Hong Kong, and kind of against the communism on the mainland in mainland China, that they wanted to emphasize, to give the church more power. And that part of the reason why we are seeing Christianity as a more obvious religion in social life and through the protests as well. But we also witnessed chants, Buddhist, Taoist, popular religious elements in the protests as well. And quite often the popular or Buddhist, Taoist religious elements are not that easy to distinguish from each other. That's again the nature of diffused religion. So Han Chinese Buddhism and Taoism and vernacular forms of popular religions, various worships, they often diffuse into each other, and that not that easy to distinguish from each other. So we see offerings of incense, of fruits, of soy milk, of various food, of drinks, of flowers, outside a shopping mall where a protester died. So people had this makeshift shrine dedicated to him and offering various food, as if they doing that maybe at home, or maybe at various activities, at various religious festivals. So that just shows how diffused religion is in Hong Kong's everyday life, in social life, and in political life as well. And so, and earlier that mentioned, there's a longer history, political history, of how religions take part in Hong Kong's political life. And that was in part mobilized Christianity, both Christianity and Chinese religions, including Buddhism, Taoism, popular religions. Religions were mobilized by different political parties throughout the history of Hong Kong. Christianity was mobilized by the colonial government, but at the same time, Chinese religions were also mobilized by the Communist Party or by the Nationalist Party before the Communist Party in the earlier part of the 20th century. So religions as an organized form of religions were mobilized by different political parties to serve their ideological purposes. But at the same time, people were being mobilized at the same time. What was being mobilized were also people's own hopes and dreams, what they wanted for their lives, what kind of society or community they had in mind. So people were actively taking part in the process of mobilization as well. People organizing themselves through religious forms, secret societies, or Taoist, Buddhist organizations, or even had those associations with religious institutions in mainland China or in other parts of the world as well. People were taking part in forming this community, their own community in Hong Kong, through religion from the very start. So when we think of Hong Kong today, when the Chinese community first emerged in Hong Kong in the early years of colonial times, the best way for them to organize themselves to serve their own community was through religion, to have various rituals, to have various societies, religious societies, secret societies. So today we see certain, in Sheng Wan in Hong Kong, we see the Memo Temple. So that was when Chinese hospitals, Chinese medical, legal kind of organization started. They all started from this temple, and this temple served the purpose of organizing Chinese community in Hong Kong and providing the sort of really secular but also civil needs for the Chinese back then. So the community in Hong Kong in a way started through religion. So that's how interrelated religions are with Hong Kong society in general. So I think in general, that's in the kind of as an introduction to your question.
Great. So, so recognizing the diversity of religious identities, kind of at this local scale, we also wanted to kind of unpack the identity of Hong Kong protesters, particularly like how political protests become a means of expression. So now we want to bring in Antony, Shirley, and Emanuele into the conversation. And to kind of hear a little bit more about the protest more specifically. So Antony, could you tell us a little bit more about like why Hong Kong has such a strong culture of political protest? Like, what's that history, and how do the acts of political protest relate to the identity of Hong Kongers?
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me. So Hong Kong is somewhat unique in the world, and this is partly as a legacy of the British colonial era. That Hong Kong has a very low level of representative democracy. We do have a legislature here called the Legislative Council, which is partially elected. Half of the seats are elected by a sort of system of universal suffrage with seats or districts similar to what you would see in Congress in the US or in parliaments in the UK or elsewhere. But the other half of the seats are elected by small special interest groups called functional constituencies. And the design of this democratic system, pseudo-democratic system, is that the pro-Beijing parties will always remain in control. So it's a very low level of representative democracy. But at the same time, Hong Kong does have, or has had up until now, and we can discuss the position after the introduction of national security law last year, but has had up until now a very high level of rights and freedoms. And these are constitutionally guaranteed in Hong Kong's constitution, the basic law. And these can include all of the rights and freedoms that you would expect in a fully democratic society. Things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and many other rights and freedoms. And so this is really a somewhat unique combination, because normally you would expect those rights and freedoms to go hand in hand with a democratic society. And for societies that are lacking in democracy, they also similarly have those rights and freedoms constrained in some way. But Hong Kong uniquely has this combination of what former last governor Chris Patten called liberty without democracy. So what that means is that when the people of Hong Kong have a grievance with the government, they can't effectively vote the government out of office. There's no mechanism through the ballot box to air their grievances, but they can take to the streets and protest and exercise those rights and freedoms that are constitutionally guaranteed in Hong Kong. And so political protest becomes an important means of political expression and affecting political change in a system where there's not a full level of democracy. But there's something I think more fundamental and going more fundamentally to Hong Kong as identity that is part of this culture of political protest, and that is this. These rights and freedoms are something that have been referred to as Hong Kong core values. And this is something that's referred to by the government themselves when they're trying to tout the benefits of doing business in Hong Kong for international businesses in particular, but also trying to sell the benefits of Hong Kong society to the people themselves. And this system of Hong Kong core values are these rights and freedoms, the common law system and an independent judiciary, a relatively transparent and a corruption-free government, and all these things are wrapped up in this notion of Hong Kong core values. And this idea of Hong Kong core values has come to become something that distinguishes Hong Kong from the rest of mainland China, and indeed much of the rest of Asia. And whereas in the past, going back 20 or 30 years, Hong Kong might have sought to distinguish itself on a material basis by saying that Hong Kong is a wealthy and developed modern city, whereas the rest of mainland China, it was relatively at the time undeveloped and not advanced and much poorer. The advances in the Chinese economy and China generally have led China very much to catch up materially, but Hong Kong has still pointed to these Hong Kong core values as the things that distinguish Hong Kong. And so in many ways, in answer to the question, what is it that makes Hong Kong, Hong Kong? What is it that makes Hong Kong a different and special place? And what is it that makes Hong Kongers? This idea of Hong Kong core values has become very important as the central as a central aspect of Hong Kong identity. And so when Hong Kongers take to the streets to protest, often it is in defense of those Hong Kong core values. And at the very same time, they are exercising the rights and freedoms that are fundamental to those core values in the act of protest. And so in many ways, the act of protest becomes a performance of identity for Hong Kongers that sort of leads to this sort of saying that we are Hong Kongers, therefore we protest, that this becomes something that is something that Hong Kongers do to express those aspects of their identity, to exercise those rights and freedoms, and they do it in pursuit of protecting those rights and freedoms when they see them as coming under perceived attack, as indeed they did during the extradition deal protest movement of 2019. So that's sort of the structural and I guess identity factors that I'd see between Hong Kong's very strong culture of political protest that has developed, in particular in the 20 years since the handover, but really goes back as far as a century ago to throughout the British colonial rule as well.
Thank you, Antony, for mentioning like the how like the core values that include of Hong Kong people that really informs some of these like protest activities that we see. As we see, and I think you also mentioned like the idea of like democracy or like this dilemma. It seems like there is a low level of democracy, but it also became a main part of like how Hong Kong people view themselves as different. So I would like to also ask Shirley about this question. So how does, or like from your point of view, how does the desire of like democracy relate to maybe the formation or the development of the local identity of Hong Kongers? And when we look at the protests in 2019, 2020, how do you see the emergence of a collective identity among protesters through a variety of protest-related activities?
Thank you, Clara. First of all, it's really a great pleasure to be here, even though I'm not on grounds, but it's great to see friends and be part of the Religion Lab. This is always a topic I've wanted to talk about, but it's not my strength in terms of study of religion. But really what I do is very tied to our topic today. a collective identity is like religion. It requires faith in common values and is what I call consumatory. It is above and beyond all values, especially material values. And that is the basis of my research, which has evolved also into discussions of high-income economies. And what academically is intriguing is very few high-income countries are non-democratic, except for resource countries, as well as, of course, in the case of Hong Kong, it is a special administrative region. It is not a country. And so the issue, of course, of collective identity is first, you have to identify who are your members. And then you decide what are those values. And this is what makes Hong Kong very interesting. And as a scholar also of Taiwan, this is much more interesting if you actually think about it comparatively, because Taiwan also went through a period of, first of all, defining who is Taiwanese before it can discuss what are Taiwanese values. So the first issue of Hong Kong, of course, is many people came from China or predominantly came from China. So is China the community, or is the Hong Kong community is the community that we care about? And I think that's very important, because religion has a component to it that is, we want to benefit all mankind for most religions. And so that sort of is at the core of a debate among a lot of the protesters. Do we care only about Hong Kong in exclusion of other people? Or do we care about other people and care about universal and liberal values? Now, on personal level, I am also a Hong Konger. I've been living there for more than 30 years. I care deeply about it. But at the same time, I'm also a Taiwanese. And that begs the question of, can we have multiple identities, or are we forced to choose to have only exclusionary identity? I teach in Hong Kong at University of Virginia the last 10 years, half a year in each places. So I see the comparison. I also sometimes teach in Taipei and Beijing. And the generation of Hong Kongers we are talking about that I've been teaching for the last decade and who are protesting grew up very differently than others. They grew up after the handover. They were educated without any direct colonial influence, but still inherited what they regard as the positive legacy of a colonial Hong Kong with its distinctive history. And identity formation, lastly, on an abstract level, is a negotiation which involves who you are as well as who you think you are not. And it's a narrative which requires consensus and discussions. It takes time and can be highly contentious. It usually is. And Hong Kong did not have a chance to do so slowly or through time as Taiwan did. The pressure came rather suddenly, and the negotiation became very intense and at times violent, if you will. And I think this is understandable if you look at comparative national identity or identity formation. So let me go into a bit more detail about the question that Clara posed. In my book, I discuss, of course, consumatory or ultimate values and instrumental values. Now, many people talk about this, that the protests originated in substandard economic structure with increasing inequality, high youth unemployment, and lack of affordable housing. So some people say there are no values. It's all about the material comfort. Now, this debate, of course, started raging on particularly over decades, but particularly since 2003, because of Article 23, the national security law that was going to be legislated. And that was in the shadow of the SARS economic crisis. So there is some understanding that there are economic pressures, but just like Taiwan, it is clear that with or without economic security, young people view freedom and democracy as consumatory, which involves a fundamental faith, and they're worth dying for, and they are of the highest importance. So in essence, they are non-negotiable. The polls show the last 2 decades that Hong Kong identity has evolved rather quickly. From 2008, at the height of people feeling Chinese, young people have now seen themselves more and more as Hong Kongers and not Chinese. They're 2 different concepts. You can think of yourself as both, as I just said, or you could think of yourself as exclusively one and not the other. Now, according to the Hong Kong Public Opinion Research Institute, 30% of Hong Kongers aged 18 to 19 said they were exclusively Chinese, but that figure started slipping rather quickly over time. And between 2008 and 2020, Hong Kongers aged under 29 self-identify as exclusively Hong Kong from 23% to now over 80% in 2020. By comparison, this kind of trend takes other communities much longer period of time. Taiwan took more than 30 years to move in this direction. And Hong Kong really shortened this, accelerated this. In each case, young people focus on the same civic values, such as democracy, freedom, speech, freedom of speech and press, and pluralism. A survey by Hong Kong youth scholars in 2020, which echo many other surveys at Chinese U, at Hong Kong U, at Baptist U, investigated the values among Hong Kong youth who said that universal value was the most important value for them. Freedom of opinion, number one, democracy, number two, freedom at any cost. They were the three most important values, and there's a huge generational gap. In older surveys, you see that the older generation believe the most important value embodying Hong Kong is rule of law. And some would also say allowing for economic prosperity. So you see this gap, this fight at dinner tables, in families, everywhere in communities, between teachers and students. So some would contend in the past, Hong Kong identity had always been a local or subnational identity. This is the word I use often too, even when I talk about Taiwan. Is it a local identity or is it a national identity? What kind of identity are we talking about? This subnational identity was actually most of Hong Kong history, compatible with pro-China sentiments, patriotism, and opposed to colonialism in its earlier form. But now it is increasingly separated from China and even opposed to it. And here is where you start seeing very big differences, which is again natural to be contentious in the formation of a narrative. The years of protest which gathered saw even more social integration leading to more economic problems, whether it's tourists or residents pouring in from China without good public policy to address the repercussion, and further inequality, the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And there are issues, of course, relating to the government's imposition of moral and national education. Over time, most protesters became united for the fight for universal suffrage. Today, being a Hong Konger becomes associated with universal values like freedom and democracy. So the identity starts to emerge, just like in other places. Now, I've always said that to have an advanced progressive community, individuals should be respected for having multiple identities and for saying who they are not. In addition to collective identity, for example, I can be a mother, a daughter, a wife, and teacher, sometimes student, but why do we need to choose? And being a Hong Konger today means excluding yourself from being Chinese at times, which in the past didn't have to be the case. You could be culturally Chinese and political identity is an overlay on top of it. But Beijing, of course, wants to define Chinese in an exclusive and political way, which makes these surveys very hard to interpret because the surveys are rather rough ways of asking people what they think they are, but it doesn't go into exactly how one defines that. And this is very similar to surveys done in Taiwan over the last 30 years. Now, the protests have led to the development of this exclusive cultural and ethnic identity at first in relations to the colonial era, then evolving to a civic one to focus on values and universal suffrage. And now, because of course of, I would say shockingly, excessive measures taken after the national security law, Hong Kong identity now is thrown in with many other elements that need to be negotiated. Anti-mainland localism, which is exclusionary in nature, but also which makes it difficult for older generation and new immigrants to be part of the movement. But also the draconian ways means that the Hong Kong judiciary has been diluted. And this is going to, I believe, backfire and resulting in more Hong Kongers wanting to redefine their Hong Kong identity. This will actually, I pretend, it will make it more difficult to actually have a collective identity in a consensual form because everyone's going to disagree about how to achieve universal suffrage or freedom. Even if we have the same goals, everybody will have a different understanding as to how to achieve it. And again, it's similar to what many other places are experiencing all around the world. For example, if you're in Myanmar today, what do you really think one can do? This is a very, very large question. So I'm going to stop there for my comment on Hong Kong, but I would just say, lastly, there is light at the end of the tunnel. if you think about Taiwan, which is where I'm sitting here today, it had been cut off from China for a century. And then differently than what many people think, it actually was inundated with Chinese the last 30 years. Tourists and actually more than 500,000 migrants, people who moved to Taiwan, primarily as spouse, but later in different forms. But then these complicated questions of what Taiwanese was took time to resolve. And the consensus today means Taiwan accepts anybody who loves democracy and freedom and accepts Taiwan's way of life. The distinctiveness of Taiwan is actually not exclusionary, but it's pluralism, embracing everybody who identifies with the culture and follows the rule and the system of governance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Now, for anyone living outside Hong Kong, which is most of the people on this call, from what we've heard, experiencing these protests primarily via media coverage, if it was, your evening news, if we even watch that anymore. But the complexity of what was taking place can be a little bit hard to grasp. So I'm going to turn over to Emanuele. So This American Life produced an initial episode, which you led, called Umbrellas Down, and then a follow-up that received lots of attention in both the U.S. and Hong Kong. Could you tell us a little bit about why This American Life decided to do an episode on Hong Kong protests in 2019 and the follow-up, and then maybe a little bit about how the episode engaged this idea of identity?
Yeah, so the reason we did the episode is because I wanted to do the episode. No, the reason we did the episode is I think that there are huge implications for global politics going forward based off of what's happening in Hong Kong. And as someone who has covered protests in the US, I used to be a reporter in St. Louis. And so I'd covered the protests following the shooting death of Michael Brown. The act of protest is just something in general that I am interested in. And so, yeah, to be honest, like a good thing about working where I work is we do get to pursue sort of our interest. And so I was watching what's happening in Hong Kong. I have friends in Hong Kong. I was having conversations, and I feel like I kind of kept telling my coworkers, like, hey, there's this huge story happening in Hong Kong. And I kept getting ignored. But I was pretty persistent with it, and I kept sort of like bringing different angles or trying to think about it different ways. And in part, the way that our show ended up being shaped in some ways was based off of sort of the non-reaction from my coworkers. Like I could present them like all of these sort of like historical facts and all this background information, and it wasn't like calling to them until I started to put sort of like characters into place. And the thing that they felt like was missing, or that we felt like was missing, was allowing there to be space for people, for you to like understand the feelings of the people on the ground. And so that's the route that we took with the episode, rather than sort of doing a big historical swath. I think we tried to bring as much context and nuance as we could, but I think we really focused heavily on giving like people the space to voice sort of their opinions and giving our audience people to relate to. And so I think that's sort of how the episode took shape, or how we thought about the episode. And for us, I think we had planned on, I think, like 40 different potential stories. We only did like 5 or 6 in the end. And like the goal was really to talk to as many people as possible and try and like cover sort of all of these different viewpoints and areas from the protest. And so in the end, we chose the stories that we chose because we felt like they best sort of like represented the things that we were hearing on the ground and the conversations that we were hearing on the ground when we were there. And yeah, I mean, for a US audience, the reaction to the episode, I think a lot of people felt like it served like sort of 2 purposes, I think. In one way, if you like had read up on Hong Kong and knew like a lot of stuff already, you might have listened to the episode and been like, but they didn't say all of these historical facts and these sort of things. Or you might have said, oh, like I actually haven't heard just people like talk at length about this. Like this is nice, it's a nice compliment to the things I already know. And then I think the other sort of reaction is I had no idea about this, like I didn't understand it, but now I'm really interested in it. That like the show in itself sort of served as like a gateway for people who weren't paying attention, who didn't have interest in sort of this issue, to suddenly feel like more connected to it. Where then they might like read all the other things and like actually like pay more attention and invest in the story because they've invested in the characters and the time that we've spent with these different people.
Thank you, Emanuele. And I think what I also like about the episode is that it really shows, like, as we talk about like the issues of like identities, like I think in the episode it just really shows like these contested identities. You have like the family, and then also like police, like the father is the police, or the son is as a protester, like all these contested identities. I think I think it's really nice like that we have the episode to demonstrate all these dynamics.
Yeah, I think it was really important to us that that it wasn't just like a focus on protesters, but that it was a focus on like so many protesters. When we talked to them, we're like, oh, my parents like hate that I do this, like they hate that I'm out there. So for us, it was important that that also be a part of it. The protests also became so much about police in a way too at one point, and sort of animosity toward police. So it was important for us, I think, to like also hear from someone who's associated with the police about like what their sort of like understanding was. And then also just the people who are sort of like caught in the middle and indifferent and like not really sure which way to direct their energies. We thought about doing a story where we would talk with some of the Filipino staff workers, like in Hong Kong, you know, they're on their days off, they're always sort of like around, and those spaces now are like also like spaces where there's protests coming through. So we tried to think about all of sort of like the different people who are trying to exist in the spaces, who all care about Hong Kong and are trying to figure out like what that means for them in the way that they want it to look in the future.
Thank you again. So yeah, like recognizing, I guess we also want to expand this conversation a little bit, like, and try to bring the connections between Hong Kong and the United States. So, so I want to also turn the questions first to Shirley, because I think what you mentioned just now about the very limited mechanism in Hong Kong, like for people to include all these like or like negotiate these multiple identities, that the idea was I was really interested in. So and during the course of the protest, we also see that like many protesters were trying to seek foreign attention, which we don't really see that in the previous protests. So and for example, the United States also play a very key role and respond to the protests in various ways. So I would like to ask, what was some of the U.S. response, and in your opinion, what are their significance to the protests?
Well, first, thank you, Clara. Yeah, I think it's quite important to note this, although I would say on a research level, democracies usually must rely on people in a community wanting it themselves. And so the issue of whether there's, quote, foreign interference is one that Beijing would like to talk about. But there is also no movement in contemporary history that does not have structural factors, meaning outside factors and endogenous factors. And therefore, we need to, and today in 2021, there is no doubt, the world is a village, even in the pandemic. The pandemic has actually made us rely much more on information from the outside while we're not traveling. So because of historical reasons, Britain has been the most active in voicing support for Hong Kong. But the US has played a central role in actually legislating first the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, which included an annual review of Hong Kong status. This is, of course, after many protesters and leaders, pan-democrats, had actually visited overseas foreign political leaders. And then the US followed up with the Hong Kong Autonomy Act, which sanctioned individuals who violated human rights in Hong Kong. And finally, import and export regulation, which is what I look at, has been extended to Hong Kong, especially with regards to sensitive technology products. These are all very important for the city. All of this is making a big difference in international attention to an issue which China insists is domestic. And I think this is where the ongoing debate will be. China has said that the Sino-British Joint Declaration on Hong Kong is no longer valid. And this week on the national security law, the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeals also said it does not have to be subjugated to the framework of the Basic Law and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So all of these pronouncements mean that international attention is necessary. Otherwise, more tragedies could happen in Hong Kong, and the world would be blind to it. But what the other countries have done on the other side, including Australia, Canada, and the UK, is something different, is to grant Hong Kongers some kind of residency and work permit. Today in Taiwan, I can tell you in 2020, 10,800 Hong Kongers have relocated, not just applied successfully, but relocated to Taiwan, which is nearly double the annual number of the last 5 years. And these having such a choice to move is all very important for young people in Hong Kong who don't see a future.
Wonderful. So just shifting back to Emanuele, so one thing we wanted to bring forward is, especially with all the events that are going on in the US at the moment, many people have been making this comparison between the January 6th insurrection in Washington, DC, and the takeover of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, something that former council member and activist Nathan Law strongly challenged on Twitter several weeks ago. So can you share a little bit about your thoughts on the role of journalism? And in your case, like storytelling and giving people a better understanding of the complexity of the protests, and again, how you can see this US Hong Kong dialogue taking place?
I'm muted. Am I unmuted now? Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I think that journalism in this case can both muddy the narrative, right? Simplify it as well as clarify it. I think you could look at pictures of the events that took place at LegCo and look at pictures of what happened on January 6th side by side and say, same thing, right? Like it's easy to sort of like try and make those comparisons, but like if you're getting to the root of what brought people to those spaces, which like responsible storytelling and journalism should, like they're actually opposing thoughts, right? Like one is this desire for a fair and free vote, and the other is an attempt to protest a fair and free election. So while they're both sort of around this, like this idea of voting, one is like attacking that, right? Which is why it's important to have like those nuances and details in place to give context, because like I said, yeah, you could put those images side by side. And I think it's also like so important to speak, to have characters and people to speak about what their motives are and what's driving them, because I think it also brings clarification to the narrative and the story that's sort of at hand. And in terms of the US Hong Kong like dialogue, like having covered Black Lives Matter protest, I see similarities in those protests in some ways, in tactics, in animosity and frustration around police. Those protests feel more similar to me than something that I witnessed on what I witnessed on January 6th. And I think in both cases, I think the other thing that maybe is in common is they both sort of feel like it's about like a belief in democracy. But in one case, it's about believing that democracy should only work for one group of people or for a certain group of people. Whereas the other, it's a more general sense of like this desire and belief that democracy is something that people in Hong Kong should have. Yeah. I hope that wasn't confusing.
That was great. So really quickly, just a note before we kind of go into our last little section. So for those attending, we would love to see any questions. I think we will have some time at the end to maybe answer a question or two. So make sure to use the Q&A function in Zoom. We'd love to hear from you.
And thank you to Emanuele again. So we want to, like in this section, we want to come back to the questions for the entire panel, the questions that we mentioned kind of in the beginning of the webinar. So one thing that came out in this project, and I think some of the conversations that we just had, is the idea or like the relationship between religion and democracy via faith or values, which in our work manifests itself through protests. And it's something that Matthew and I are still kind of struggling to come to terms with. And so there is a great moment in our piece where Jeffrey Choi, a Hong Kong organizer based in Washington, D.C., reinforced these ideas. And we want to play the clip a little bit to the audience.
So I think there's, I guess, a spiritual aspect to it. I don't mean like a religious spiritual aspect, but the spirit of the movement is penetrated in these events, right? Or it's manifested, or it's amplified through these non-traditional methods.
So having spent a little bit of time during my PhD digging deeper into the meaning of democracy, there's a lot to think about here. It's a terrain that, again, Clara and I were kind of trying to think through as we were listening to the many voices we heard from. And it made us think a lot about, Jacques Derrida's ideas on the democracy to be, and especially in this moment, reading Nicole Hannah Jones writing in the New York Times about how the Black struggle for racial justice is like the clearest manifestation of democracy in the U.S. And we've all mentioned it, either the U.S. Declaration of Independence or the basic laws of Hong Kong kind of both create the foundation for these demands for democracy. We want to think a little bit more about that with everybody.
So I think the questions that we would like to ask is, what do you all see the connections between the faith in religion and the faith in democracy, as they realize either in Hong Kong or globally, as protest seems to surround us. So I guess we can go with the order of the speakers. So we can start from Ting, and then Antony, and then Shirley and Emanuele. So Ting, would you like to share with us a little bit your thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think as Jeffrey mentioned in the video audio clip just now, I think there's a so to speak the spirit of the movement, the spirit of democracy. That's something that people highly value. That's what Hong Kong protesters highly valued as well. I think that spirit it doesn't have to be religious or purely secular. In fact, there's often kind of religious or spiritual element in secular values as we know them today as well. Speaking of the democracy, democratic values in the US as well, we know, although the separation of the church or state very clearly in the US, but there's such kind of vibrant religious kind of appearance and diversity or dynamics in the US in relation to issues of democracy, issues of value, and that so is the case in Hong Kong as well. And in this way, in this very, again, in a very diffused way, we almost in the kind of form of a civil religion as we see emerging in Hong Kong. And as I mentioned, there was this kind of really makeshift shrine or commemoration of the protesters who died. And they were not just him and other protesters who unfortunately died in various ways during the movement. They are remembered as martyrs of the movement, or martyrs of Hong Kong. And this is a very powerful way of reckoning a kind of identity through the movement in relation to democracy, all these big questions, identity and democracy, who are we as a community, what do we value in Hong Kong? And that kind of commemorating, recognizing a community's own martyrs, this is a very powerful way of linking spirituality and democracy, linking spirituality and values, democratic values. So I think this is what we see in today's world, the very blurred line between religion and secular values, kind of in particular in pursuit of faith. It doesn't have to be strictly through religious means, organized form of religion, but there's always this element of faith. And I also like to point out the very important element of feeling or affect, maybe we as more kind of holistic view, or maybe a academic way of framing it, because power is something that we feel before we conceptualize it. That's what all powers do, political powers. But for the people, identity is also something people feel before they could conceptualize it, or before they could put it into words. And religion and or the kind of spiritual, or the kind of civic religion, if you like, they also manifest in very emotional or very effective forms. As when we commemorate the protester, for instance, and that's how the collective identity, and that's how the very strong, intense emotions are felt through this, and through such very effective, very spiritual ways of commemorating and kind of emergence of identity. I think that's where we see very important questions are being asked, but also very important answers being emergent through this. So yeah, that's how I see it.
Thank you, Ting. And I definitely remember in some of the interviews for the podcast that like some interviews mentioned like when they went into these religious like rituals or like singing, like something that they remember strongly is that like the feeling or the emotions that emerge, and that really that kind of feeling really changed the way how they see the protest. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And Antony, would you like to share with us your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I guess along similar lines to those just expressed by Ting. But I mean, the one thing that I think is very important is the role of ritual in the Hong Kong protests. I mean, in the protests of 2019. In one way, I guess in a slightly flippant way, you could argue that the pattern of the recurring weekly protests, where every weekend people would turn up to a certain specified location and engage in a protest, and this went on sort of week after week, month after month in 2019, was somewhat like going to church, right? Everyone would turn up at a specific time on the weekend and engage in this ritual together. But I think there are other really interesting rituals that were engaged in as part of the protest movement. One was very striking were these so-called shopping mall protests, where protesters would gather in a shopping mall specifically to sing the protest theme song, Glory to Hong Kong. And they would also chant protest slogans, but sort of the specific ritual was the gathering in malls and singing a song, which clearly is a ritual, a gathering of people to sort of express this shared belief, and the role of affect, as Ting just mentioned there, was incredibly strong. Hearing this very powerful song being sung in that echoing chamber of the shopping mall atrium, not unlike a church with its acoustic qualities. And this was something that would be regularly scheduled, and the ritualistic aspects of those shopping mall singing protests were very strong, I think. Another example were these vigils outside Prince Edward Station, one of the subway stations where police had attacked protesters, and there were all sorts of conspiracy theories around that there had in fact been people that had died in that attack, and the police and the authorities were covering up the deaths. Now, I've got to say that that's fairly I think a fairly wild and unlikely conspiracy theory, but nevertheless, people would then set up an altar outside one of the subway station exits and had these vigils, as Ting was mentioning, and rituals for the dead, burning of paper money, the putting flowers and burning incense and these sorts of things, and this became a site of ritual where people would gather, on the one hand, to engage in mourning for these supposedly fallen protesters, but also, of course, to express outrage against the police and against the authorities. And so I think these different kinds of rituals, and these are just two examples, and these sort of creation of sacred spaces as a part of that has been an important aspect of sort of the spirituality of the protests. And interestingly, these have been things that have been specifically targeted by the authorities in the year after the protest, and in the wake of the national security law. They have sought to specifically target these expressions of faith, if you want to put it that way. So effectively, the slogans have been declared illegal and banned. The song "Glory to Hong Kong" has been banned in Hong Kong schools, and I think it has all but effectively been declared illegal by the authorities. I haven't heard it played or sung since 1st of July last year. The police went as far as saying recently that if anyone was caught putting flowers outside the Prince Edward MTR station exit on the anniversary of the events that happened there, they would be arrested immediately, just for the act of placing flowers there. Just the act of commemorating or even attempting to engage in that ritual was declared an arrestable offence. And so now that the government and the authorities are seeking to prevent any of these expressions of faith that are associated with the protest movement.
Thank you so much, Antony. And definitely, I think like the idea of like recurrence of these type of activities, and seems like people know like their roles and what they have to do when they come into these activities is part of that like ritual aspect. So thank you for pointing that out. And maybe we can turn to Shirley for her remarks on that.
Thank you, Clara. I think in concluding this panel, this is a very good question, because spirituality of the movement leads to implications, and I want to address that. In my book, I basically talk about the philosophical difference, as I said, between ultimate values, consummatory values, and material values, or instrumental values. And as John Dewey who used the term for the first time, consummatory value is one in which the depth and intensity of meaning is so heightened as to constitute a pervasive, qualitative, and organizing whole. What this means is that debates over consummatory values like identity will be more intense and feature more extreme alternatives than debates over instrumental values like housing or subsidy, basically resource allocation. This is especially true when policy does not respond to consummatory values of the people. Hence, you have mass protests or religious war. The importance is in believing. Now, believing in the value of a just, fair, and open society with freedom and human rights for all people, just like believing in a religion, is all-consuming, but it still leads to, as I said before, a debate as to what to do. And I want to just point out one fact, and many people, international observers, have still been under the illusion that a gray man, for example, drove democracy and gave Taiwan democracy. But others would contend that Taiwanese people fought very hard over time, and that is the nature of religion. Believing and fighting, even when you go through decades and decades of frustration and failure or tragedies, including people of faith, starting with the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan, which fought very hard for a very long time And democratic institutions in Taiwan today continue to be very fragile. Today, Taiwanese society is supported by men and women of faith, ranging from Buddhist organizations like Tzu which run hospitals, and Catholic institutions managing women's shelters and homes. So the lack of understanding, I think, by Beijing that human beings are spiritual by nature and cannot be reduced to material beings who need nothing more than shelter and comfort. This gap of understanding is very hard to bridge. My current book about the high income trap in Hong Kong, and you could find my articles in Chinese and English about Hong Kong. The essence of an advanced and progressive society, of course, is the belief in equal rights to everyone, whether rich or poor, powerful or powerless, and that we are compassionate towards other in our community. At least that's what I define a progressive and wealthy community to be. Now, Hong Kongers believe that they should be represented by a more responsive government, which treats all people with dignity and respect. And this faith and spiritual understanding in freedom, not oppression, will only deepen if it continues to be denied. Thank you.
Thank you for the remarks, Shirley. And let's turn to Emanuele.
Yes. I'm going to take a little bit of a different approach and talk a little bit about this idea in context of the US. So the idea of faith in democracy or belief in democracy, I don't think I have had to think about that expression or those phrases until this year. It feels like it's something just that is solid and has always been there. And it's interesting to hear the idea of faith in democracy or belief in democracy as a thing, because now it feels like a thing in a way that it hadn't before. And so I think echoing sort of what Shirley has said, and also what Matthew was saying about the Nicole Hannah-Jones piece, it just makes me think a lot about specifically the African-American community in this year's election. And democracy is not something that has necessarily worked in some ways for the African-American community, right? There's systems and structures and a lot of barriers being put up. But echoing Shirley, the believing and the continuing to fight despite that, right? And when I think about the images from this year's election that have stuck with me, and I was talking with a reporter who's also named Emanuele, who works for BuzzFeed about this, but he was talking sort of about the images of this election are so many Black people who are trying to make democracy work, whether that is people on Stacey Abrams' team, whether that's vote counters in Detroit who had protesters yelling at them, gathered outside telling them to stop counting, whether that's the Black Capitol police officers who were holding back Trump supporters on January 6th. And so I think for me, at the core of these images is sort of me realizing and looking at this idea as democracy not being this guaranteed thing, but a thing that we have, that there's a faith in and that there's a belief in. So I think that's something that just has changed for me from where I'm sitting in the world this year.
Thank you so much, Emanuele. That's a great way to end. But thank you to everybody else, Shirley, Antony, and Ting, for everything you've brought. At the moment, I'm not seeing any specific questions in the Q&A. Maybe we've done such a wonderful job that everybody is so enthralled by what we're talking about. But we've got just a few moments if anybody has a quick question that maybe we could throw out. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap up the event.
Can I just say, Matthew, I wanted to say I really enjoy Emanuele's series. Was listening to all of them, and I wish there had been 40 interviews. But anyway, we got what we got, and I'm really pleased. And as Emanuele said, it featured the everyday story that I talk about as a political economist, but without the context that Emanuele has in going to the dinner tables, having discussions with protesters and their parents. And this is what I see every day with my students in engaging. They're trying to engage in discussions with older people like us and trying to tell me what they're doing. And I found the program to be invaluable. So the viewers should go look it up.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. Maybe another option we could ask is we could ask, and maybe one of the panelists might want to ask another panelist a question.
If I could talk a bit more about the relationship between religion and democracy, religion and politics. There's also this very complicated relationship between religion and democracy, religion and politics. On one hand, religion can be a powerful form through which people can express themselves, express their political opinions. But on the other hand, religious organizations can also be a powerful form of mobilizing or taking advantage of people's desire to have their political voices heard. For instance, there's just incredibly a large number of Trump supporters in the Sinophone, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in China as well, who are evangelicals and Trump supporters. And that's just one complicated kind of manifestation of how religion and democracy, religion and politics work together. They are evangelicals, or they support Trump, also because they believe in democracy. They believe only through a certain form of Christianity, and Trump is part of that they could attain democracy for the humankind even. But at the same time, we also see liberation theology, for instance. We also see, I think Shirley already mentioned, in Taiwan during the democratization process, and in Korea, in South Korea as well, religion was a big part of the process of democratizing. So I think this maybe spirituality, as this panel is entitled, spirituality is maybe as a better way of kind of showing people's own agency rather than maybe religion per se as something that could be very easily about the organizational form or the power of the structure of such institution. Thank you.
So we do have one question that just came forward from the audience, and this is from Ju. Wonderful conversation. I was wondering if the panelists could comment on what kind of impact this spirituality aspect of a protest will have for the religious situation in mainland China. Maybe that should go to Ting or...
Not me.
Religious situation in mainland China. Mainland China has its own kind of religious activists. Many of the kind of political activists in mainland China are religious. For instance, many of the human rights lawyers are Christians, and many of the kind of Christian leaders are very active activists who are very kind of outspoken activists themselves. And I think this, on top of that, this kind of religion and democratic pursuit in Hong Kong and elsewhere, I think that has definitely a positive impact, and definitely kind of a strengthening their faith in what they believe, what they've already been practicing already, because Christianity in particular as a global religion, as a religion that of course has its own very indigenous contextual form, but at the same time emphasizes this very almost universal, a certain universal aspect to it. I think there's always this connection, very close connection between Christian activists in China and Christian activists in Hong Kong. So yeah, definitely kind of encouragement almost. Yeah.
Thank you, Ting. So with that, we actually are coming to an end of the event. So just really wanted to say thank you again to everyone. Thank you to Emanuele Berry, Antony Dapiran, Ting Guo, and Shirley Lin. Thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today. no matter if you're in the US or in Asia. And a reminder to join the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab on March 4th for the next program in the series, again, the screening of the lab's new documentary, God in Green, An Unholy Alliance. This will be joined by Catherine Stewart, a journalist and author of The Power Worshippers, Inside the Dangerous Rise of the Religious Right, and Olufemi O. Taiwo, assistant professor of philosophy at Georgetown University.
And if you're interested in learning more, please take a moment to visit the Religion, Race, and Democracy Lab website and listen to the episode, The Spirituality of Protest in Hong Kong. And if you want to learn more about any of the speakers' work, we would like to share with you Ting's new article, So Many Mothers, So Little Love, Confucianism, Parental Governance, and the Discourse of Motherly Love in 2019 Hong Kong protests, which will be available soon, which we really look forward to read about it. You can also follow Professor Lin's work at the UVA Miller Centers, as well as listen to Emanuele's amazing work at This American Life. And Antony's book, City on Fire, The Fight for Hong Kong, is also available on your choice of online platform, but we also recommend you picking it up via your local bookstore. So you can find us all on Twitter if you want to continue the conversations. Thank you for joining us again.